Imagine sitting beside a prehistoric fire while someone quietly hands you dinner. There is no plate, no fork, no menu, and absolutely no customer service desk where you can ask what exactly is floating in the stew. Then you notice one of the bones beside the fire looks disturbingly familiar. So, did prehistoric humans eat other humans? Yes, some of them did. But probably not for the simple reason you are already imagining. Starvation may explain certain cases. It does not explain all of them. At several prehistoric sites, human bodies were cut apart, stripped of flesh, broken open for marrow, and discarded in ways remarkably similar to butchered animals. Elsewhere, the treatment was slower, more deliberate, and possibly connected to the way communities handled their dead. One group even transformed cleaned human skulls into carefully shaped cups because prehistoric tableware occasionally came with a previous owner. The clues are not written confessions. They are cut marks, fractures, tooth impressions, strange engravings, and even a calorie calculation suggesting humans were not the most efficient prey available. Which means the real question is not simply whether our ancestors practiced cannibalism. It is why the same act could mean hunger, violence, ritual, or something the bones can no longer explain. Let's examine the evidence. The answer then is yes, but not in the way the word prehistoric usually appears in our imagination. There was no single prehistoric culture, no universal tribe, no ancient committee distributing one deeply troubling cookbook across 3 continents. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of years, different environments, and several kinds of humans. At some sites, bones belonging to Homo antecessor, Neanderthals, or Homo sapiens carry strong evidence that other humans cut them apart, removed flesh, broke open bones, and sometimes consumed the edible tissues. But those sites are exceptions, not a description of daily life everywhere. Only a minority of known prehistoric assemblages preserve convincing evidence of cannibalism. Even that observation has limits, because the archaeological record is terrible at preserving ordinary behavior. Bodies decay, bones disappear, camps erode. Acidic soil can erase an entire person while leaving archaeologists with a stone tool and several thousand years of unanswered questions. Still, the surviving evidence pushes this behavior surprisingly far into the past. At Gran Dolina in northern Spain, Homo antecessor remains from roughly 800,000 years ago were butchered alongside animal bones. That makes the case much older than our own species. So, cannibalism was not invented by modern humans, and it was not one permanent habit shared by every ancient population. It appeared in particular places, under particular conditions, among groups that may have understood the act in completely different ways. The difficult part is proving which bones represent a meal and which represent something else. Before archaeologists can decide whether a person became food, they have to reconstruct what happened to the body. A human body is not a convenient package of separate pieces. Muscle anchors tightly to bone. Joints are wrapped in tendons and ligaments. The skull protects the brain, and long bones protect marrow. 2 energy-rich tissues sealed inside containers, evolution apparently designed to resist impatient customers. To remove flesh, a stone edge must pass repeatedly over particular parts of the skeleton. Cuts near muscle attachments can suggest defleshing. Marks around shoulders, elbows, hips, or knees may indicate disarticulation. If someone wanted marrow, they could strike a long bone until it split. A bone broken, while still fresh, bends and fractures differently from one that cracks centuries later after becoming dry and brittle. Then there are tooth marks. Human teeth may leave pits, shallow scores, crushed edges, or damage where a person gripped and pulled tissue from a bone. Carnivores can also bite, scrape, and scatter remains. Sediment can drag across a surface. Roots can etch lines. Even trampling can produce marks that look suspicious under the wrong light. This is why archaeologists use taphonomy, the study of everything that happens to remains from death until excavation. They compare the shape, depth, location, and microscopic structure of marks. They examine which bones survived, how they broke, and what animal remains were found beside them. No bone arrives with a label reading, "Processed for dinner." The body leaves a sequence instead: skin removed, joints separated, muscle stripped, bone opened. And when that sequence appears again and again, the explanation becomes much harder to avoid. And this is where the dramatic story becomes inconvenient. A cut mark on a human bone does not automatically mean someone ate the person. Bodies can be cut for several reasons. Flesh may be removed during a secondary burial. Limbs may be separated to transport remains. Bones may be cleaned, displayed, reshaped, or deliberately damaged after death. In some cases, stone, sediment, roots, or trampling can create lines that imitate human workmanship surprisingly well. So, archaeologists do not ask only, is there a cut? They ask where it is, how it was made, what happened before and after it, and whether the same pattern appears across the rest of the skeleton. Are marks concentrated where large muscles attach? Were joints systematically separated? Were long bones struck while still fresh? Are marrow-rich parts heavily broken while less useful parts are missing? Do human bones show the same butchery sequence as deer, horses, or other animals found nearby? And after processing, were all of those remains discarded together? A carefully cleaned skull placed in a burial area tells a different story from a skull smashed open and thrown among butchered animal bones. The physical action may overlap. The sequence, frequency, and final treatment may not. This is why prehistoric cannibalism is rarely identified by one spectacular clue. It is identified by convergence: cut marks, percussion damage, fresh fractures, tooth impressions, skeletal part patterns, and archaeological context all pointing in the same direction. Archaeology is not a detective show where someone finds one scratch, removes their sunglasses, and announces that dinner has been solved. One mark creates suspicion. A repeated pattern creates a case. So, what does that repeated pattern actually look like? Imagine archaeologists lifting a broken human arm bone from the floor of a cave. Under magnification, narrow stone tool cuts cross the areas where muscle once attached. Other marks appear close to a joint, where tendons would have to be severed before the limb could be separated. The shaft was then struck while the bone was still fresh, splitting the hollow center and exposing the marrow. Each clue still has alternatives. But when the marks occur in the correct anatomical places, follow a practical order, and repeat across many bones, coincidence begins to require more imagination than butchery. The comparison with animal remains is especially important. If deer, horses, or other prey from the same layer were skinned, dismembered, defleshed, and broken in the same pattern as the humans, then the human bodies were probably entering a familiar processing system. Different animal, similar procedure, and sometimes the clue becomes almost uncomfortably direct. At Gough's cave in England, researchers studied a human radius, the forearm bone-bearing cut marks, percussion damage, and marks attributed to human teeth. The bone had been processed for edible tissue and marrow. But it also carried a deliberate series of zigzagging incisions that did not fit ordinary filleting. The order matters. The body was not simply decorated and placed aside. Processing marks in the engraved pattern occupied the same bone, turning it into evidence of both consumption and deliberate modification. It does not reveal what the people believed or what rule everyone around the fire understood, but it does reveal action. Muscle removed, bone opened, tissue consumed, surface marked. Marrow, incidentally, is evolution's version of a calorie snack stored inside a container that requires a rock and unreasonable determination to open. That is the forensic signature archaeologists look for, not one scratch, but a complete behavioral trail. And once that trail appears in a nearly 1 million-year-old cave deposit, the story becomes much older than ritual skull cups. Now, the timeline stops behaving like a story about modern humans. Travel to northern Spain, to a cave site called Gran Dolina. Deep inside a layer known as TD6. 2. Archaeologists recovered the remains of Homo antecessor, an early human population that lived roughly 800,000 years ago. The bones belonged to several individuals, and the assemblage was dominated by infants and other immature individuals. They were found among stone tools and the remains of deer, horses, and other animals brought into the cave. And the human bones had entered the same processing system. Stone tools had cut through skin and muscle. Joints had been separated. Long bones and skulls had been struck while fresh to reach marrow and brain tissue. Some surfaces carried tooth marks. Valuable anatomical parts were processed intensively, while the resulting fragments were left among the remains of butchered prey. Different bodies, almost the same procedure. This is why Gran Dolina is considered one of the earliest strong cases of systematic human cannibalism. The pattern is too extensive to dismiss as one unusual burial, one accidental cut, or one extremely confused carnivore. But why did it happen? One interpretation is simple nutrition. These bodies provided meat, fat, marrow, and brain just as animals did. Yet researchers have also proposed something more confrontational. The victims may have come from another human group entering or being brought into the territory used by the people at Gran Dolina. In that reconstruction, cannibalism was not a desperate community eating its own dead during one catastrophic winter. It may have been predation directed at outsiders, repeated across more than one event. We should be careful here. The bones do not preserve an ambush. They do not tell us who attacked first, whether the victims were deliberately hunted, or what relationship existed between the groups. But the possibility changes the picture. Humans are inconvenient prey. They carry tools. They cooperate. They remember faces. And if you attack one, several relatives may eventually arrive with opinions. That makes the Gran Dolina evidence more than an ancient menu. It may record a world in which another human group could be competitor, enemy, and occasionally prey. The easiest explanation is hunger. And sometimes, hunger was probably enough. Prehistoric food supplies were unstable, herds migrated, plants disappeared beneath snow or drought, injuries could prevent hunters from working, and a few unsuccessful days could turn an ordinary camp into a biological emergency. Under those conditions, an available human body contained protein, fat, organs, marrow, and brain tissue that starving people might not ignore. But survival cannibalism is only one possibility. A body might also be consumed opportunistically. Someone had already died. An enemy had been killed. The group had edible tissue in front of them, and no modern rulebook insisting that human muscle belonged in a completely separate moral category. Then there is predation. At a place like Gran Dolina, outsiders may have been treated as both competitors and food. Consuming them could provide nutrition while also removing rivals from the landscape. Efficient, in a grim sort of way. Except the calorie mathematics creates a problem. One published nutritional model, built from data on modern adult male bodies, estimated roughly 126,000 dietary calories in total, with about 32,000 in skeletal muscle. These are approximate comparison figures, not a prehistoric nutrition label. They still make the basic problem clear. Deer could provide several times more muscle energy, while a mammoth could provide millions of calories. Humans were also unusually dangerous prey. They could recognize an ambush, throw weapons, coordinate resistance, and belong to a group capable of revenge. From a purely nutritional perspective, attacking them was like selecting the smallest meal in a restaurant because it might organize a counterattack. This does not mean cannibalism was never about food. Calories still mattered, especially during scarcity, and smaller prey can be easier to transport or share. But the numbers make one conclusion difficult to avoid. Some prehistoric people probably ate humans because humans were available. Others may have done it because the victims were human. And that difference takes us beyond nutrition. The behavior did not belong to one species, one region, or one moment. Move north from Spain to the Troisième cavern of Goyet in Belgium. There, archaeologists identified fragmented Neanderthal remains dating to roughly 41,000 to 45,000 years ago. Their bones carried the familiar sequence: cuts where flesh had been removed, fractures made while the bones were fresh, percussion marks associated with opening them. The remains were processed in ways comparable to horse and reindeer carcasses from the same cave. Goyet became the first unambiguous case of Neanderthal cannibalism identified in Northern Europe. 4 bones were also used as retouchers, pieces of bone pressed or struck against stone tools to reshape their edges. Some remains had therefore passed through several categories: a person, a source of food, then a tool. This was recycling in the most brutally literal prehistoric sense. A 2025 reassessment made the assemblage even more unsettling. Researchers identified at least 6 individuals, 4 adult or adolescent females and 2 juveniles. Genetic, isotopic, and skeletal evidence suggests that the group was not a random sample of natural deaths. Several individuals were non-local, and the demographic pattern appears selective. That strengthens the possibility of exocannibalism linked to conflict or the deliberate targeting of outsiders. It does not identify the attackers with certainty. Neanderthal perpetrators remain the more likely explanation, although early Homo sapiens cannot be completely excluded. Other Neanderthal sites preserve very different treatments of the dead, so Goyet cannot define the species. Cannibalism was not a biological identity. It was a behavior chosen under particular circumstances, and sometimes the same bone could be both a meal and an object worth keeping. And this is where eating stops being only about nutrition. Anthropologists often separate cannibalism into two broad categories. Endocannibalism involves consuming someone from within your own community, often as part of dealing with death. Exocannibalism involves consuming an outsider, perhaps an enemy, captive, or member of a rival group. The distinction sounds tidy. Prehistory rarely is. A pile of bones does not preserve family names, tribal borders, funeral speeches, or the uncomfortable conversation in which everyone agreed what would happen next. Archaeologists may identify how a body was processed without knowing whether that person had been loved, feared, hated, or barely known. Still, those relationships would have mattered. Consuming a relative could have been understood as keeping part of the dead within the group, transforming the body rather than abandoning it, or completing a duty owed to someone who had died. Consuming an enemy could communicate domination, revenge, exclusion, or the complete destruction of that person's identity. These are possibilities, not subtitles written beneath the bones. But food is already social language. Every shared meal establishes rules. Who receives the best portion? Who eats first? Who is permitted near the fire? Who takes the final piece while carefully pretending not to notice that everyone else wanted it? Cannibalism would make those rules far more serious. The identity of the body, the people allowed to participate, the parts consumed, and the bones kept afterward could all turn a biological act into a statement about belonging. The dead person was no longer simply a source of calories. The body could become memory, warning, trophy, obligation, or sacred material. And that may explain why nutrition and symbolism are so difficult to separate. People can consume a body because it is edible while also believing the act changes the dead, the living, or the relationship between them. That is exactly what appears at one late Ice Age site in England. There, people did not merely process human bodies. They turned parts of them into carefully made objects. Around 14,700 years ago, Homo sapiens occupied Gough's cave in what is now southwestern England. The human remains they left behind were intensely processed. Bodies were disarticulated. Flesh was removed. Long bones were broken. And some fragments carried human tooth marks. If the evidence ended there, this might look like nutritional cannibalism. It does not end there. At least 3 skulls were modified through a careful sequence. Soft tissue was removed, facial bones were detached, and the uneven edges of the cranial vaults were deliberately shaped. The result was a set of objects archaeologists call skull cups. That name sounds like an archaeological attempt to make the situation less unsettling. It is not. These were human skulls transformed into containers. And then there is the engraved forearm bone. After the body had been processed, someone repeatedly cut a zigzag pattern into its surface. The marks required attention and effort. They were not necessary for removing meat, opening the bone, or preparing an ordinary tool. The people at Gough's cave did not appear to divide the body neatly into either food or sacred remains. A single mortuary practice may have involved consumption, careful modification, and the creation of objects that were retained or used afterward. We cannot know what filled the skull cups, whether they were used once or repeatedly, or what emotions accompanied them. The evidence preserves neither prayers nor explanations, but it does challenge a comfortable modern assumption. Eating a body and respecting or ritualizing that body are not necessarily opposites. For the people inside this cave, consumption may have been part of how the dead were transformed, and that is far stranger than simple hunger. So, what is the honest answer? Yes, some prehistoric humans ate other humans. We know this because certain assemblages preserve more than an isolated scratch. They contain systematic defleshing marks, separated joints, bones broken while fresh, evidence of marrow extraction, human tooth impressions, and treatment closely resembling the butchery of animals found nearby. We can also say the behavior appeared among different human populations across an enormous span of time. Homo antecessor at Gran Dolina, Neanderthals at Goyet, and Homo sapiens at Gough's cave did not belong to one culture or follow one shared tradition. But the motives are less secure. At Gran Dolina, nutritional exploitation and conflict between groups are strong possibilities. At Goyet, selected outsiders may have been consumed, and some bones became tools. At Gough's cave, consumption occurred beside careful skull modification and engraving, suggesting that treatment of the dead carried meanings beyond simple hunger. What we cannot recover is the explanation spoken around the fire. We do not know whether every victim was an enemy, relative, stranger, captive, or person who had died naturally. We cannot measure grief from a cut mark. We cannot identify revenge from a broken femur. And we cannot call an act sacred simply because it required care. The bones preserve verbs: cut, separate, break, bite, shape, keep. They rarely preserve the reason. So prehistoric cannibalism was real, but it was not one universal instinct or one primitive custom. It was a collection of behaviors that could serve survival, conflict, mortuary, obligation, symbolism, or several of these at once. And then there is us. We still decide what should happen to a human body after death. We bury it beneath stone. We burn it and preserve the ashes. We donate it to science. We keep hair, jewelry, photographs, fingerprints, or an urn on a shelf. None of these practices feels unusual when everyone around us agrees on the meaning. That agreement matters. A body is biologically made of tissue, fat, bone, and water. But the moment we recognize it as a person, it becomes something more difficult. Family, identity, memory, responsibility, and sometimes fear. Prehistoric communities faced the same problem without cemeteries, funeral companies, legal paperwork, or a customer service desk explaining the approved procedure. Some buried their dead. Some bodies remained in caves. Some communities removed bones and returned to them later. Others consumed human tissue, broke open bones, or shaped skulls into objects whose meaning disappeared with the people who made them. Now return to that fire. The bone beside the meal still looks familiar. We know how it was cut. We may know that marrow was removed. We might even reconstruct the order in which the body was processed. But we cannot hear the sentence spoken before the first cut. We cannot know whether the skull cup was raised in grief, obligation, triumph, or remembrance. The bones can show us what prehistoric humans did to one another. They cannot preserve what the gesture meant.